Okay, well, thank you to all of the Duxwa attendees, members who've joined us today. We are so excited to have everyone here. I know everyone's had a great time. We're learning a lot, engaging, connecting, and that's what the goal of this afternoon session is. It's a contemporary lens on what excellence looks like in science writing communications. And I don't know if anyone has taken the prize winners course at Johns Hopkins, if anyone was in that science writing program, but the purpose was to deconstruct excellence in the craft, right? So what do some of the best science writers do to make their stories resonate with readers and so great? And what we wanted to do was take a 2026 lens to this. So we are thrilled to introduce 3 outstanding award-winning writers and producers and science communicators who are writing across all different mediums or sharing stories across all different mediums: radio, print, digital, YouTube, and they're staying relevant and they're still successful today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to provide a brief introduction to our panelists. We're going to show a short video of Sciencing Out. It's a great PBS series and that Ray produced. And then I have 5 questions that I want to ask. We're going to run this a little bit like an informal podcast, so it's going to be very organic. The panelists are welcome to introduce their own questions. We'll have fun. And then we're going to hand this over to the audience and our online session for a Q&A. And we have until 3:45, so we'll go ahead and get started. First, I would like to introduce Nell Greenfieldboyce. She is an NPR science correspondent. She's been reporting at NPR for 20 years. And before that, she's written for outlets like US News and World Report and The New Scientist. She wrote the book Transient and Strange, and she received her undergraduate and graduate degrees at Johns Hopkins and taught science writing there for about 4 years. So we'd like to welcome Nell. Next, we have Lindsey Leake. She is an independent health and medical reporter, and you'll see her reporting for national outlets like NBC, Medical News, and CNN. She's written for Fortune, the USA Today Group, Sinclair Broadcasting, including our local WJLA, Channel 7 station, Medscape, WebMD, Cancer Today, Inside Precision Medicine, and she graduated from Princeton and earned 2 master's degrees. One in journalism and digital storytelling from American University, the other in science writing from Johns Hopkins University. She was a senior editor for The Science Writer at Hopkins, and she's a graduate thesis advisor. So I'm sure a lot of people have worked with Lindsey. We were excited to be in the same program with her in graduating in 2020. Reyhaneh Maktoufi goes by Ray, is a science communication specialist and social science researcher at National Geographic Explorer. What's really neat about Ray is she both writes, produces content, is a co-host, and then she also studies science communications and publishes research in science communications journals and trains scientists on how to make their content really engaging and resonate with audiences. And so we're thrilled. We're going to be showing a short clip of her PBS series, Sciencing Out, which focuses on different ways women throughout history have shared information about science. She's also produced podcasts for Story Collider and has served in many different appointments and fellowships, including Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and she was a visiting science communications researcher at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. She graduated from Northwestern University with a PhD in media science and technology. So I am going to show a short clip of Sciencing Out.
For years, there have been many women all around the world who've communicated science to the public. Complicated science, you know, things like Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the theory of general relativity, and the laws of thermodynamics. And we are going to meet 2 of them. The first is a brilliant mathematician and communicator, alive about 1,650 years ago, right here in Alexandria, what used to be Egypt's capital. Let me introduce you to this historical, incredibly awesome lady, Hypatia of Alexandria. Whoop, whoop! Let me hear you say, Hypatia! Hypatia was one of the first known female mathematicians. She was super independent, crazy smart, and had a love for making knowledge accessible to everyone, and not just the nerdy kids in school. But this kind of work isn't all ancient history. No. Fast forward to today, I want you to meet another amazing woman, Nalini Nadkarni. Yep, this lady climbing this tree like it's no big deal, like it's, oh, you want me to climb this gigantic tree? Hold my drink. And all of that in the name of science. Suffice to say, she had a lot in common with Hypatia, including her enthusiasm for communicating science to everyone. Let's start by setting our time machine for 1,650 years ago, Alexandria. From a young age, Hypatia was a true scholar. When I was a kid, I was spending my time failing at Super Mario and Tetris. But Hypatia was learning math and sciences from her father, Theon. Nope, not that Theon. This Theon of Alexandria. Hypatia became an expert in math, astronomy, and philosophy, wrote multiple commentaries on scientific pieces, gave lectures about Plato and Aristotle. You get the picture, she was very accomplished. Hypatia was out there crushing it. She was like, I'm not gonna sit in a corner of this library that doesn't even have good Wi-Fi with this meh light and just talk to the ghost of the books. I'm gonna be like the coolest ancient science communicator in town. But obviously she thought that she's a modern science communicator because ancient for us is modern for her, and then you get it. You get it, right? And she was like,
Okay, so Ray has produced a few of these outstanding YouTube series called Sciencing Out. I would tell everyone to go home and watch these. They're about 10 to 15 minutes. They're sort of just like watching your favorite TV series. They're really good. She uses a lot of humor, narrative storytelling, and she also brings a lot of historical elements about science with the modern day lens. So our first question for the panel, and Ray, if you want to start, because this is, I know, one of your passion projects, is going to be, what was one of your favorite articles or a piece of work that you have written on, and why?
Okay, first of all, like really weird watching this. We recorded that during COVID year. That's why it's like in a shed outside with weird audio and everything. So this is gonna sound weird, and like bear with me. When I was in grad school, I was experimenting with like writing different stories, and something that I wrote at the time was called Taxonomy of Farts, the Science of Grounded Theory. And it was basically me trying to experiment with how do you talk about methodology, because it's a very boring topic to talk about. But I thought I was fascinated by grounded theory. It was just kind of like you go in a field, you do a taxonomy, you like do a lot of like ethnographic method to collect data and analyze them. And at the time I was just like mesmerized with like little doodles of farts. And this ended up being a project where I thought I'm doing it for my own, like it's gonna be on my blog, and it's like all these different categories of like stress fart, smelly farts, all this like different things. And at some point, when I looked at my data, I noticed that every year, in a certain period of time, I don't know who it is, but from a university, there is like 30 visits for this one blog post. And I was like, oh my God, is someone using this to teach something to universities? And that kind of encouraged me that last year when I had my, a year and a half ago when I had my first talk at National Geographic, they let me use the example of farts to talk about the importance of visual difficulties and examples that are funny and curiosity-inducing. And it was a really fun experience. It helped me also realize that you can embrace your quirkiness and weirdness and all these fun things to add excitement to science and whatever you want to talk about.
I guess my story is a lot less funny. I was going to say I don't write profiles often, but one of my favorite pieces that I've written, it was during COVID back in 2021. At the time, I was a local news reporter at TC Palm. It was part of the USA Today network in South Florida. So early 2021, the vaccines had just come out, and at that time, of course, everyone was scrambling to get them, at least in Florida at that time. They were only available to people 65 and older. The rollout was really messy, we all remember. And so I had been covering that for a while, and then this actually coincides with my time in the Hopkins Science Writing Graduate Program. This story started with an assignment for one of my courses, and I decided to do a profile on one of the people at these drive-through clinics administering the vaccines. I was like, everyone's talking about the vaccines themselves and how no one can seem to get them, but no one's really talking about who's giving them. So I was able to find this physician who volunteered. A lot of the people who administered vaccines were volunteers. She, by day, was an OBGYN, also volunteered with the Medical Reserve Corps, and that's how she ended up doing these vaccine administrations. And that was just a really fun profile I did. I guess it sounds kind of cliche to find ordinary people doing extraordinary things, but I think this was a good example of that. And I got to shed light on her story, and she was really great. Just also we kind of dove into how when she was in medical school in the 70s, she was like one of the only female students. She had no women, surgeons to look up to. So it ended up being way more about a lot more than the vaccine administration. But that's just an example of a profile I enjoyed.
I think that's interesting because I love profiles, and you're making me think I want to do a profile. It's sometimes, when you want to do a story, it's sometimes worth thinking about, like, if I was going to do this as a profile, like, who would I profile, and do it that way? Because I think that most people really are interested in people. Like, somebody told me once, or there's some story about somebody who, like, took their dog to the zoo and thought their dog was going to be so excited to see all the animals, and they took their dog and was like, look, it's a hippo, and look, it's a, camel or whatever, and the dog was just going around, like, smelling other people. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think people are even more like that. And, I report on science, but I sort of see it as mostly people want to hear stories about people. I love a lot of stories. My favorite story is always like the last story I did. The last story I did was a couple days ago. It was about this weird fish that lives in the desert hole pupfish, which is like one of the rarest fish in the world that lives in this godforsaken fishbowl made of rock. And I was doing a story about how they had declined to only 20 fish left, and so these wildlife biologists had to decide whether they were going to supplement the wild population with this backup captive bred reserve population they had in a tank. But what I liked about doing this story is that when all this went down in February of 2025, it was right when their agencies were being hit with massive layoffs, and there was also like a looming government shutdown. So I felt like that added like a real sort of like personal human side to the story that even people who aren't interested in a fish could relate to, like having to make this irrevocable decision under extraordinary pressure. And I also thought it was like, for me as a writer, it was this kind of interesting parallel between these fish who had suffered a couple of like seismic events, like unprecedented seismic events, and the federal scientists who were like simultaneously going through their own kind of metaphorical seismic events, and they just sort of like came together in this one moment. And I also like that story because there was some stuff in there that maybe wouldn't have been put in a press release. Well, first of all, about the chaos that was happening at the time, but also about some of the decisions the researchers made under duress that other scientists disagreed with. So, that was just a story I just did that to me, it sort of brings together all the things I like about science reporting. Like when you can dig up something a little new that wouldn't otherwise be out there, when you can tell a story that's about people, when there's like a certain level of weirdness to the whole thing because it's this weird fish. And also it has a kind of writerly aspect to it, a sort of like metaphorical side to it. It doesn't have to like hit you over the head, but it's there, and I think people get it.
Thank you. These are all excellent. Now, the second one is a little bit of an extension of this. It's going to talk about impact. So the question is, what is one of the stories or, broadcast videos that you produce that has been one of the most impactful? And a lot of times we, think about impact, maybe it's reach, it's reaching a mass number of people, maybe at the right time. But we were talking before in the video session and a lot of other circles, we think about engagement, right? Really reaching a narrow audience, or maybe it's changing someone's life, giving, multiple views that people haven't heard before, or maybe shedding light on something new that people haven't really heard about. So the question will be, what has been, for readers, the most impactful?
So one of the topics, I think it came up during the keynote, and I think someone was talking about it when they were asking the questions, was this idea of the deficit model, that like we used to think for the longest time that if we just provide the certain scientific data on things, or say like this is what the science says, people would change an attitude or a behavior. And a big bulk of what I do is kind of like talk about like, well, data is good, science is great, but it might not be enough to change an attitude, to change a behavior, to change a feeling, a lot of that. And usually when you talk about these kind of things, like you get it, but sometimes it doesn't stay with you. And I wonder if this is especially something you all could relate to. When you find the right example or the right metaphor, and you're like, I will hold on to this with dear life, because this is the metaphor that people would get, like raise your hand if you're like, yes, this is, yeah, okay. So I think that's what happened to me, where I was like, oh, I think this is what gets people to get it. And it was a story about, so I grew up in Iran, where all the schools are girls, and I didn't have a boyfriend until I was like in university. And when I go to the university, I have a boyfriend, and he's like the worst person you can date. And he was like lying and sending me like the wrong text message that was like very obviously not intended for me. And my friends would like tell me, would be like, this guy is like really not the right guy, like he said that to you. They would show me this like facts and data. Would I break up with them? No, right? And everyone can relate to this story because either they have been in these relationships, or they know someone, or they watched a movie or something about that. And when you ask people, they're like, yeah, because it's emotional, you're in love, you think you can change them. You basically engage with what earlier we talked about in the keynote, motivated reasoning, right? This is where you start justifying, like, oh no, you don't know them like the way I do, or like, this is not what they mean, I can change them, so all of those kind of stuff. And then we talk about how things like climate change, vaccination, these are kind of like getting people to break up with like bad information. It's not something that you could just be like, this is a fact, this is the information. These are emotional things. These are connected to people's identity, sense of security, all of those kind of things. And when you kind of use like that metaphor, that story, people kind of like get it. And I've been having a lot of people coming to me be like, I get it, I know why, and then they keep talking to other people about it. So I use that story in a lot of my workshops and things to kind of like get people started on why facts might not be enough.
I think for a lot of us, or at least that from what we can see, it's hard to measure story engagement, not just how many people, saw your story posting on TikTok, or on the back end, how many people, how many clicks you got on a story, but like you said, real measurable impact. But I think one of the few examples I have is, and I think most of the stories I'm going to mention today are spin-offs of other assignments I got. So this was also in 2021, back at that Florida paper. I was covering a lot of COVID. I got assigned to write a story about local blood banks and how this was a nationwide problem, all the shortage of blood donations during COVID. And so I did that story, but in the course of interviewing the representative from One Blood, that's kind of like the Red Cross, they said, yeah, well, this isn't just a COVID problem. At any given time, we don't have enough blood from donors of color. And this is like this huge nationwide problem. And I was like, well, I did the story I was assigned to do, but I was like, oh, there's something else here. I wanted to do a kind of a spin-off on that. And then I also don't do a lot of commentary or any other stories that I insert myself into, but this was one. And I'm half Black, and I was like, well, I've never donated blood. Like, am I part of the problem? And so I ended up doing this story that started out with my own blood donation, and then I used that to go into the larger issue of a lack of diverse blood donors across the country. And I featured this gentleman who was suffering from sickle cell disease and talked about how they need all these blood transfusions, and how that's, the shortage of blood is contributing to, the problem with these patients. And then that ended up winning, correction, didn't win. I was a finalist in the National Association of Science Writing Awards for 2022. So, and then, that recognition was nice. But as far as measurable impact, one of the Martin County Health Department in Florida, they told me that they decided to like host a blood drive just based on that story. So I was like, all right, if I got one county health department to do one blood drive at least, I feel like that was one of the few moments where I could really measure a story's impact.
It's hard to know the impact of stories, yeah? Like, you throw them out into the void, and most of the time, nothing happens. Like, even the people you talk to, like, they might not even, like, email you, like, you're just, like, waiting, are they mad at me or whatever, and, like, you don't hear anything back, It's, like, it's demoralizing. And, I think there's, like, different levels of impact a story can have. Like, there's moments of joy you can give people that are important and meaningful, and like you'll never measure them and they'll never show up on any kind of dashboard of measurable things. Like, you know, I did a story about a weird Twinkie during COVID, right? Like, and like my colleague Jeff was like, I cannot believe you're putting this on All Things Considered. Like, I was like, no, people need this. Like a weird Twinkie, like this is good. And it was very popular. And then there was another story I did where I profiled this animal eyeball lab, and they had eyeballs from like all kinds of animals, like giraffes and, you know, snakes and everything. And I was like, dude, this is your big chance. Like, what's the eyeball you want? Like, you know, is there an animal eyeball you don't have? Because like we can get you that eyeball. And he's like, well, we don't have any of the really big whales, you know, like a blue whale. And like, sure enough, a year later, somebody happened to have a whale eyeball, and they typed like animal eyeball, like museum or whatever. And like the first story that came up was my story saying this guy wanted a whale eyeball. So I felt like that was a moment where I had like a real impact. But most of the time it's nothing, it's crickets, and you're just like, well, am I wasting my life? Like, what is the point of this? And so I feel like you can really only amuse yourself, you know? Like, that's the main thing. Like, that story on the pupfish I did, like, not a popular story. It did not go viral. It's just like, I poured my heart into it, and like, it's just like, you know, the world moves on. But like, by God, that was the best pupfish story I could do. It had an impact on me, and that's what I really care about, because I'm very selfish.
Well, humor has been a point that we've heard a lot today and that we're seeing on the panel. I know everyone is really good at using it. And in the video session, I know Kasha Patel had mentioned, you know, if you're funny, you can use it. If not, maybe experiment with something else. And so one of the questions I had was, how do you sort of, you know, capture people's attention? There's a lot of, you know, complicated science information that we're researching, we're breaking down. We want to make it interesting to the public. There's a lot of different ways to do that, right? So humor, maybe it's storytelling, maybe you're using different visuals, different video, but also, you know, capture their attention and keep it. Are there 1 to 2 things that you find yourself consistently going to, you know, over time for your stories that work really well? And Lindsey, one request we have online, I think people are having problems hearing you.
Oh, okay.
Muted. All three? Okay.
All of us, can you hear me?
Okay,
Hold the mic
we'll do a
closer.
test.
Does that work?
Okay, and whoever wants to start can go.
I can go. I don't use I'm funny in real life, I like to think. I don't use a lot of humor in my writing, but one thing I like to do is kind of leave clues, so to speak. So I'm a big mystery fan. That's been my favorite genre since I was little. And so I always try to leave the reader hanging in every paragraph, because, you know, the goal of any sentence is to get your readers to read the next one. So I try to, you know, and as much as I'm allotted within a short word count, I mean, the story could be, like, I cover nutritional supplements a lot. I mean, it could be, that's not that mysterious. But I try to, and it's hard because you don't want to bury the lead, and you're not always given the opportunity for a longer anecdotal lead. So you do kind of have to jump out with the core information, but then I try to really unravel, you know, the rest of that inverted pyramid, and always leave people wanting more. You know, like Nell said, some people, you know, not everyone reads to the end still. We're working on it. But yeah, I do like to leave people wanting more until they get to the end.
Yeah, I think that's very true in radio, especially because, or audio, because, you know, people are listening, and so if their attention wanders, then they're gone, right? Like, they've just kind of moved on. And also, like, if someone's listening to radio and the stories are coming up one after another, and they're not necessarily choosing those stories, right? So you have to appeal to people who may not think they care about, you know, like primordial chemistry in the early ocean or something, right? So I always try to look for something, some connection that people have in their life. whether it's like a personal experience or like science they had back in grade school, or, I mean, I did a story once on making science posters. It was about the nightmare that is the scientific poster session at conferences. And, you know, I was like, well, everybody's made a science poster, right? Like in grade school at the science fair, you have to like get your piece of cardboard or whatever. And, you know, I thought that that would be an okay story to do, not just because of that sort of like personal connection, which is what I led with, but also even if people aren't really into science, you know, conferences, poster sessions, everybody's had the experience of wishing they could change something in their industry or their life that's this long entrenched tradition that maybe isn't working for people anymore, but nobody seems to be able to stop doing it that way. So I tried to bump up those aspects of it, right? Like, not so much, this is a story about a science poster session, but this is a story about, you know, a revolutionary who's trying to, like, you know, change the culture of something, which I think a lot more people could relate to.
Kind of building off of what Nell was saying about like find the thing in people's life that they connect with. I think I talk a lot about the science of science communication, and sometimes it can get very niche, but the principles of science communication are just principles of communication. So I try to a lot of times even find like daily normal stories, like the bad boyfriend stories, to talk about some of the concepts within communication. Like recently, a dog in the street attacked my dog, and I got like really rattled, and I started screaming at this guy, and this guy like kind of like started screaming at me, and there was this like lady standing next to us. And once he left, I was saying like, oh, I think he was lying when he said like his dog ran away. I think the dog was just unleashed. And the woman that was next to me was like, oh yeah, what a great observation. Like, I haven't thought about it. And then as I was thinking, I was like, oh, you know what? I actually do remember that dog. I think the dog did run away. But the reason I could do that was because that lady was not like, let me play devil's advocate. I think you're wrong. I think you're judging this man. I felt very safe because she was giving me the safety of like, you just had a traumatizing experience, whatever you want to talk about, like, yes, I'm here with you to experience this, which helped me analyze my feelings and my facts and my data and not feeling judged to be able to get to the right conclusion. So I use a story like that to talk about like when conversations are heated and debated in science communication, this is not the moment to be like, let me play devil's advocate. I think you're wrong about this vaccine thing. Like, no. This is the moment where you're like, that is really scary. I am so sorry you felt that. What made you think that, right? So I do a lot of like kind of figuring out what is something that people can relate to and then use that as an example. So in social science, again, like one of the concepts that is so important about storytelling is this idea of narrative transportation. This is the thing that is correlated with people actually like being more open and changing their mind. And you all know like the transportation is like when you're like watching a movie or reading a story and someone calls you and you're not hearing them because you're so in the story and you're feeling what the person is feeling, you're like seeing what they're seeing. So one of the things I try to focus on, and I'm not always successful, but I try, is building moments that transport the story. So a lot of times, like when we work with scientists to try to get them to tell a story, they want to be like, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. And you're like, no, you don't, you're going to give me a slice that the audience can stay with. And then you try to add a lot of depth to the slide. So where were you? What happened? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? Were your hands sweaty? Were you hearing something in the background? Did you touch that thing? How did the touch feel to really get your audience to be in that moment? So the more you can find, even if it's like 30 seconds of someone really being in that moment, I think that's really helpful with the storytelling.
One of my favorite modes of storytelling is trying to build character, but that's hard when I like to do longer features. That's kind of my thing, but day to day to pay the bills, I usually do, shorter study-based stories, and there's not always that time for character development, but I try to squeeze it in where I can. So I'm trying to think recently, or a few months ago, I did a story for NBC, and I started out with, okay, I think the opening line was like, so-and-so is a busy woman, and she, goes to choir practice, then she does gardening, then she does yoga, she goes to the gym, she does this, whatever, a few more sentences, then I'm like, also she's 85, and she's like a clinically recognized super ager, and then the story goes into, the neurology of, octogenarians who have I believe the specific definition is like they have a memory capacity of someone at least 20 to 30 years younger, and then this recent study that came out, about how their brains are different. So even though I only had maybe, I don't know, under 100 words to introduce this woman, I try to just get in a little bit of character development when I can.
Yeah, I think you don't need a lot of space actually to tell a pretty rich narrative story. I mean, a pretty common story length for some of our radio shows is 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And you can squeeze a lot into 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And I do think that there are very few sort of like grand epic themes that humanity struggles with. I mean, you can find lists of them online. They're commonly talked about in drama and theater, sort of like human struggles with nature, human dealing with their, legacy of their parents, like, human dealing with their own finite mortality or whatever. And I think it's often useful when you're doing a science story to figure out, like, does my story fit into any of these categories, And if it is, that's a signal to you that you can use that category in the back of your mind to select the specific details of a million different details that you're going to choose to put in your story. The other thing I think is really underrated is just simply laying out what happened in the most straightforward way possible as a story. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Nell, Greenfieldboyce, NPR News, right? Like, we don't need like talking heads to like, tell us what to think about it or to like, whatever. You're just like laying it out for people. And I think that when you do that, I think it frees up the audience to just make their own, to participate in it in their own way, right? Like, you're not trying to tell them what to think or what to feel. You're just telling them what happened.
Is the volume okay on this one? All right, got it. This isn't necessarily advice I received, but it's advice I would like to give to everyone in this room, especially anyone who might be in a pivotal place in their career. So I am relatively new to freelancing. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who was laid off fairly recently. In my 16-year journalism career, I've been laid off 4 times, most recently from Fortune last year, and I finally made the pivot to freelancing. Even though this was something I'd reinvented myself so many times following layoffs, and this one hit me particularly hard, and I was like, should I just leave journalism? Should I leave science journalism? And a lot of people were like, oh, why don't you try real estate or, something that I had no interest in or anything like that. But I had a lot of soul searching to do, and ultimately I was like, I love this. I went to school for it. I'm invested in it. We need this. And I know it's so hard, not just for science journalism, but for journalism right now. And here I am at this panel, which a year ago at this event, that was my first time coming to the professional development day, and look where I am now as a fully fledged full-time freelancer. So, taking these opportunities to rebuild If you've just been laid off, I'm with you. If it's not your first layoff, I'm also with you. But yeah, anyone who's either just getting into the field and everyone's telling you, you know, your parents or whoever, don't get into science journalism, or if you're thinking of leaving, please stay.
My advice was just like scream into the microphone, like, everyone run! Just like sometimes my brain just like shuts down. I also have been laid off, and I've been doing freelancing, which is, oh my God, I have so much respect for people who have been doing freelancing for a long time, like LLCs, oh my God. I don't think I have any good advice other than, we talk a lot about trust building in the context of science communication, but I'm realizing like career-wise, so much of opportunities are coming out of like building trusting relationships with like all kind of people, like going into spaces that you normally would not go. And it's exhausting to be doing like networking in this like completely new spaces. But I know like a lot of like the opportunities for me came out of people that either like saw my social media content, which is not only like the science of science communication, but a lot of it is just like me being like, I'm sad, I'm gonna cry today. Or just like making stupid jokes. But yeah, just like invest a lot in like building relationships, especially with corporate funders who have money so that we can follow our passion projects.
Yeah, I feel like I have no useful advice to give anyone because, you know, I was starting out in my career in, let's see, 1995, which, you know, feels like ancient history. Like you know, some of my earliest internships was sorting through faxes. Do you know what I mean? Like, I got my first job by circling a classified advertisement in the literal Washington Post newspaper. I mean, some of the stuff that people have to deal with now, like I just can't even imagine. Like I look at the rates for freelancers and it's like the same amount of money I was earning or less that I was earning back in 1995, right? I mean, it's just brutal. So much of what I have to say would be completely irrelevant and possibly even laughable at this point. I will say that one thing that I had to struggle with early on in my career was there were things I wanted to do, but I hadn't done them yet, and so nobody believed I could do them. And you get into this kind of catch-22 where you want to write for a certain publication or you want to write a certain kind of thing, and you don't have any clips or any evidence that you can do it, and so no one will let you do it. And then it's this like thing of how do you finagle a chance to do it? And so that to me is like kind of a trick that people have to continuously pull off. And like, I don't know what it's like these days, but when I was doing it, I was working for a monthly magazine of a science association, and I was writing for people with PhDs and MDs, and that's not what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be doing more popular science writing for just, you know, average people on the street. But I hadn't done that yet. And so all of my clips were, you know, for doctors and stuff. And so, you know, I literally was like sending pitch letters to like Cat Fancy magazine, and like eventually there was like a bar next to where I lived, and they gave out the free, it was called the Baltimore Gay Paper. It was like the free weekly paper. And I wrote a physical letter to the editor, because that's how you did it back then, with some HIV related pitches. And he was just like, these look great, but I can't pay you any money. And I was like, that's fine. And so I just like did these stories for free. And then all of a sudden I had these like clips of, you know. So, I mean, I wouldn't encourage you to work for free to get exposure, because that's like a bunch of BS. But it is this trick that people have to pull off. And, you know, I don't know how you do it. You have to try like a million things that don't work. I mean, that's the thing, is like, you look at people with jobs and they tell the story of their career like it's this linear path, you know, that they planned it all out and everything. But, I mean, do you have any idea how many jobs I applied for that like I did not get? Like, jobs that in retrospect I'm glad I didn't get, because they would have been a nightmare. But at the time I was desperate, you know? And so like, you just have to keep trying stuff. And like, you know, but be careful what jobs you take, because you may get stuck in them.
One of the questions that we were talking about is what it looks like to maintain trust with readers today and objectivity. A lot of career growth strategies today look at fostering long-term relationships with viewers or readers, right? In addition to all of the other things that we're doing with writing, networking, staying on top of beats, the latest science, we also have to promote our work, right? Being on social media. So how does everyone, promote yourself?
I can start with this one. I will start with, well, I guess all of it's difficult, but it's been a little different as a freelancer to try and, I'm hoping to still build long-term trust with readers. And, in my short time as a freelancer, like I think most of my stories have been with NBC. So I guess I'm almost sort of a regular, and I'm trying to, really build off those readers, but then I have, these 5 other publications where I've only done 1 or 2 stories, and those are relationships I'm still building. I think the best thing we can do, at least, when I write for outlets that are for a general audience, is just to communicate that science is never finished. I think we all saw that with COVID about, how everyone lied about what it was and where it came from and all that, because we were still learning. We were still learning what the best protocols were and all of that. So I try to do that with everything, every topic I write about today, just communicate what is known, what isn't known, and just being really upfront about what we don't know. I do occasionally get a positive email from a reader. It's rare. The negative ones, far outweigh that, especially in the early COVID times. You wouldn't believe how many people blame me personally for there not being enough vaccines in South Florida. But it's getting better, but I still am, that is one of my professional goals going forward, is as I'm freelancing for all these different outlets, how do I build that trust, with readers when they're coming from different places?
I usually try to focus a lot on, so there's the work of John Besley and Anthony Dudo. They wrote a book, Strategic Science Communication, and they lay out, there's some interesting research on it, like the 5 items that you really need to build trust with audiences. And I think in academia, we really focus on competence, showing your competence and expertise. But if you think of like all of the Marvel movies, there's like an evil scientist, because they're very competent, but they're very low on like warmth and care. So when you build trust, you have your competence, you have the showing you're warm and you care about people's future, you have your honesty and integrity, which you were mentioning, just like sometimes saying like, we don't know. You have your mutual values, so there's like a new Pew study that came out where like there was people perceive scientists to have like very low like commonality between like sharing like the public values. And then you have openness and empathy, so just like being a scientist and going and just like listening to people. So whether it's like I'm working with scientists or I'm creating my own content, I really heavily focus on vulnerability, which is one way to show that like honesty. There's a lot of people in the room that like use social media. Earlier, Sam with Tiny Matters from Chemical Society was like telling me how they use a lot of like questions that comes in, like audiences are like, I'm interested in this, and you're like, I'm gonna make a story about this. What a beautiful way to show people that you're open about the things that they're saying. So there's like very small like bits and pieces of things you could do to show any one of these things. I don't know is one way to show your honesty. Like being like, I'm miserable right now because of the things that are happening is when you show your vulnerability. So I would just like think of like what are the kind of like things that we might be missing into our list of trust building. And a lot of times people also like, oh, like if you're a scientist, you don't have to prove your expertise or your competence, so you can work on other things, which in that case I would be like, well, I'm a small brown lady with an accent, which studies have shown that all of those things are things that make someone see me as not competent. So if anything, I do make sure they know that like, hey, like I have a PhD in this and I've studied this and I've done like, I drop all of my numbers and like my 15 years of experience. So you do have to like get all of those points in some shape or another to build that trust.
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to this question. Like, I don't know how you can show people that you're trustworthy other than you know, if somebody's trying to prove to me that they're trustworthy, I usually start not to trust them. Like, if somebody says, like, you can trust me, I'm just like, ugh. So it's again, it's one of these, like, sort of conundrums, right? I mean, to me, like I think something that's very important to me is that if somebody is going to be criticized, or if somebody is going to be, you know, called, if somebody's going to be like questioned about something they were doing or something like that, or if there's anything slightly sketchy about what they're doing or whatever, it's very important to me to just like lay it before them very frankly. Do you know what I mean? And be like, your critics say you're a racist. You know what I mean? Like let's not do a story just like hinting at it. Like, you know, just lay it out there and like, you know, let the person respond. Or like, you know, you can't like, you know, pussyfoot around these things, right? Like you gotta, I think your listeners or your readers have gotta feel like you're sort of like their proxy. You're out in the world and you're like, you know, it's your job to like kick the tires and, you know, look around and take it for a test drive and then report back, right? They don't want to hear that like you were too scared to ask to go for a test drive, or that you didn't ask, you know, about the financing plan or whatever. Like, you know, you have to like, I think that we're raised to be polite and we're raised to sort of elide difficult situations. And, you know, if you were invited to a dinner party and something sort of awkward and embarrassing happened, like we're socially conditioned to like smooth it over, you know, and like don't address it. You don't turn to the person and start like poking at it, right? But if you were a doctor trying to, you know, diagnose a problem, it would be your job to, you know, to like open a wound and start like looking around in there, right? And so, you know, you're doing a professional job, and like your audience and the people you're interviewing expect you to do a job like a professional, right? And people accept behavior from professionals that they do not accept from other people. Like, I met a guy the other week, I let him stab me in the shoulder with a needle, right? Like, just, like, I would never do that with any random person, but that's his job, right? And so I just think that, like, the way you build trust, or the way I try to build trust, is by doing my job even when it's excruciatingly uncomfortable. You know, when people are gonna get mad at me, or when people are, like, telling me I shouldn't do something, or wishing I wouldn't, or, you know, it's like, sorry, you know? Like, I'm not gonna be mean or anything, but, like, I have a duty to report back.
Can I add something? Because I think this brings up something that is super important, is trust building is also like a strategic project. So I think you are the proxy for the audiences, right? So when you are talking to a scientist, the way people can trust that story is like, this person on my behalf is like really showing me the honesty of this conversation. And I think in your case, it would be like, this is what people want to know, right? Like, tell us the truth. Like, what do you have to explain for this? Versus there's like another situation where like it's a heated debate and it's probably someone else's, maybe someone that is like doing conflict resolution, where they might be like, I might not actually ask you directly. Like in this case, I'm gonna first try to bring the temperature down, only listen, only see what's going on, and maybe another day would be a day where we talk about like, okay, like this happened, can we talk about that? So I think depending on like the situation, what your job is, who are you representing, who's your audience, what is your goal for this conversation, even the trust building kind of looks a little different, which I think is just like a good way of thinking of like what's your strategy for any conversation you go to.
And this will be our last question before we open up to the audience. But is there, sort of speaking to like passion projects, is there something that if there was unlimited time, money, you know, resources to cover a new topic story, what would you report on? Or alternatively, is there something that you're working on that you're really excited to share that you want people to follow that's coming out soon?
I guess I'll say I would I don't have a good story yet, but I would like to write a book eventually. I always thought it was going to be the Great American Horror Novel, and that could still happen, but it's more likely that it will be something, based off my medical reporting, but I also am aware of, the time and effort that it takes, and you have to really, 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 really love it enough to stick with it for years on end and do that reporting. So I'm not there yet, but I'm really looking for something, what my next spin-off story could be. That's maybe book length.
Yeah, I have projects I'm working on, but in terms of like what would I do that I haven't done yet that I would really like to do, I really like nonfiction books that take one event in history and just sort of, one forgotten event and just kind of bring them to life and show how they kind of resonate with the present day. I love those books. So if I could do that, if anybody has an idea for a forgotten moment.
I was going to ask you for an idea, but.
Yeah, I have like a very short attention span, and I get like bored very easily. So I kind of like want someone to write a communication book for someone like me. And I like a mix of like, like if I get a book, I'm like, does it have pictures, please? So I would like to work on, and I am like very slowly working on a book on the science of communication based on stories and comics and pictures and doodles and all sorts of things for someone that gets bored easily.
Excellent. Well, we can go ahead and open it up for questions. And if you want, you can go to start with the mic, but we can take yours first in the meantime, if you like.
Okay. So you guys all talked about things that, this came up earlier at the beginning, that kind of strip judgment out of your work and that you're naturally kind of doing. And so the reader gets to make their own decision. And we were talking this morning about how that's not always the case. So I was wondering if there were things you could share that help you do that, or that you would encourage others to do to kind of allow the reader, no matter where they're coming from, to pull their own things out of it, but they're still getting accurate information they can use.
Well, I wasn't here this morning, unfortunately. I had a plan I couldn't break this morning, so I missed the session. I'm not quite sure what it was referring to. I mean, what's that old saying? It's like, I am human, let nothing human be alien to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I tend not to make harsh judgments about people. But sometimes I do. Sometimes I think they were doing something that was clearly wrong. I think that, nobody wants to be preached to. Nobody likes, a smarty pants. The urge to point stuff out and tell things to people, for me, is just kind of like omnipresent, right? Like with my kids when they were little. Like they would be just like enjoying the world, experiencing the world, and I would want to like keep pointing out to them things, and it's just like, why don't you just shut up? Do you know what I mean? Like, I do think there's sort of like this feeling in almost every story that there needs to be some kind of expert, like, an expert says, like, and I just feel like people are kind of the experts in their own life experience, and like, you don't need an expert to like understand like a huge conflict of interest. Do you know what I mean? Like, if there's a huge conflict of interest, you don't need a university professor there pointing out that this is ethically troublesome. You know what I mean? So, and I think that when you do that in a story, it's sort of like, it creates this kind of like talking at people or talking down to people, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure I'm guilty of this too. I just, like, it's a hard thing to communicate experiences to other people, internal experiences. And so sometimes it's, in my view, it's better just to describe events as simply as you can. And then people will talk about them later with their families or whatever. Like, you don't have to put everything in a story. Like, there can be space for the audience or the listener to, draw their own conclusions or like, you know, have their own reactions or, yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes people try to like cram too much into a story, like, rather than just keeping it more simple. I don't know. Now that I say this stuff, I'm thinking about all the times I did this stuff and I'm feeling awful about it. I don't know. I'm going to shut up now because I don't.
Well, thank you for answering first, so I could think for a minute. I think we still, as journalists, take the approach of sharing, I don't want to say many sides of an issue and letting people make their own informed decision. But like Nell said, a lot of times, hopefully they're, smart enough to make their own decisions about it. But at the same time, I mean, the issue of false balance comes up a lot of the time with climate change. But like for me in health, I'm not gonna, just so that you can make an informed decision, I'm not gonna say, well, this person says, the COVID vaccine is good and this person says it's bad and you should decide and just throw it all out. I mean, I'm gonna go with the science. I'm not gonna include, like necessarily a 50-50 split of an opposing issue. But yeah, you do have to relinquish control a little bit, put some trust in your readers, just like we're asking them to trust us.
Yeah. I'm stealing two things from what Nell was saying even earlier in the talk. One was, there's like these extraordinary things that happen, and then we're like, oh, I'm gonna tell the extraordinary stories, but it's like so much the human stuff that matters. Like I remember the example that I always use, we have a National Geographic explorer, Tony Wu, and he starts one of his stories with like I remember like this year I was gulped by a whale. And then in my workshops, I'm like, who has been gulped by a whale? Raise your hand. Anyone here? No. And then he's like, yeah, this was after I had a job that I really didn't like. I was so exhausted by it. I think it was in finance, and I wanted to quit my job. Has anyone had a job that they were exhausted by it? Yes, okay. And I think this was like the rest of the conversation. And I think something that is important is like, what is the human in all of these extraordinary stories that everyone can be like, I might not get this event, but I get the feeling of being stuck in this. I get, even with vaccine stories, I get being scared for my kids. What is the thing in the story that you can explain that people can get? The second part, again, stealing what Nell was saying, is that over-explaining, right? This is kind of like when sometimes, like when we have like trained scientists to tell personal stories, there's always like a soapbox moment, which is like, and this means that this is this, and then, and again, like I do that sometimes too, and it's like, no, let it finish with you crying. Maybe this is the ending. And then people would like know what to read into it. But I think what is important even about that is the thing that like the solution journalism works on. Is anyone familiar with solution journalism? They talk about complicating narratives. So you go in these spaces, and instead of going in with like, this is the story, this is what happens, this is what is the conclusion, is you go in really with questions, with things of like, I want to understand why this person is thinking that. It's kind of like therapy where you're like, I'm sad, and like, why are you sad? Like, I don't know, I feel like I don't like this space. Why don't you like this space? Because it reminds me about how lonely I am. And it's like, oh, it's a problem of loneliness. So how do you get to the core of those stories that are things that people can connect with? And this helps them also understand what is this story really about, not just in the surface.
Like,
Charles?
like I was thinking about that story about, do you remember The Atlantic had that story when the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War texted the bombing plans to the reporter? I thought that story, first of all, like what a story. Second of all, I thought that story was a master class in just laying out events. Do you know what I mean? Just like this happened, this happened, this happened. Then I was sitting in the parking lot of the supermarket thinking, well, I guess if this is true, in about 30 minutes, bombs will start falling. Do you know what I mean? Like, it was just like this. And I mean, like, when we tell stories in our own life, that's how we tell stories, right? Like when you go home and you're just like talking to your spouse or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, the craziest thing happened at the grocery store. Like, you know, I pulled into the parking lot and I got out and then I saw, like, that's how we tell stories, right? We're not like telling a story and then we're like, but now let me, you know, have this parking lot expert come in and talk about whatever. But somehow, like when we're doing journalism, so often it gets somehow like, I don't know, it gets put like through the Bland-O-Matic or something, and it like comes out like like people are chewing our own food. It's for us, it's weird, and I don't know.
I guess speaking of sort of having a more like minimal approach to your angles, we have a question online from Sally James asking, have you revisited a story you reported in the past and found a brand new angle on that old story?
I don't know if this is answering the question. I didn't necessarily find a new angle on an old story, but I found a different angle. So this is a funny story. This was when I'd been at Fortune for 3 weeks, working remotely, and my editor messages me on Slack, hey, so-and-so pharmaceutical reporter who we usually have cover these White House briefings can't make it today. So can you, in like 45 minutes, can you get on a call with Mark Cuban and ask the questions for her? And I was like, my mom was visiting. I ran into the living room. Mom, I have to interview Mark Cuban like in a half hour. But I had no idea what I was talking about with the pharmaceutical stuff. At that time, I had just started covering the topic. I'm sure everyone in this room has had that panic moment where you have to do an interview on deadline about a subject you don't know a lot about. And so this was about pharmacy benefit managers and prescription drug pricing, all this stuff. Mark's super nice, by the way. The conversation ended up being fine. So I did that story. But as a little side note, in the course of my interview with him, he just happened to mention like the cost of his virtual colonoscopy. So like I went back to him like a couple months later and I was like, hey, so you mentioned you had this virtual colonoscopy. I want to do a story on it because people don't really know what this is. And so, I ended up, we just did like a quick email interview. I got like one quote from him, but it was still an example of like just someone using this little tiny nugget that wasn't what the story was about for something totally different. But I went back to that because I remembered that one thing that they said, and then I ended up getting 2 stories out of it.
I revisit stories all the time. I mean, partly because I'm just curious about what happens to certain things, but also because I'm fundamentally lazy. And I've already done all the background research, so now I can just do another story. Like when that lab got that whale eye, you can bet I did a story on them getting their whale eye. The pupfish story I just did, I mean, I did a story on the pupfish like a few years ago. And so like I literally just like was like wandering around. And I was like, oh, I know they do spring counts. I wonder how the pupfish are doing. And so I just like emailed the program manager and like got a new story out of it. It's good to talk to people. It makes you feel, first of all, like, you're establishing this relationship with them. And so then if you need, they could tell you things. And, you should just always be checking in with people, that you've talked to for stories before. And, I think revisiting not just the stories you did, but the stories other people did can be really useful. Like David Kestenbaum did this really beautiful story about, it was called like Homemade Spaceship. It was about all the handmade labor that went into the space shuttles. And he like went and like interviewed all the people at the sewing machines who like sew things and the people who make the tiles by hand. And so when the shuttle program was ending, like I just remembered that story and I was like, oh, I wonder what all these people are gonna be doing, And so I just like went and found all those people and talked to them about what they were going to do. And I just was very upfront about it. I was like, X number of years ago, David Kestenbaum did this story and we just went and found those people. You know what I mean? Like I like reporting where the reporters are very upfront about how they did the story. Like that Atlantic story about like getting the text and everything. Not only was it like sequential events, but it was just like very straightforward about like how the reporter did the story, how the reporter was feeling, like the fact that they thought like this can't be true, it's got to be a joke, why they called, who they called, what they were surprised by. I love that when you go like on a sort of narrative, like a mystery story, right? Like you're curious about something, and I feel like people don't do that enough. Like, they try to find everything out and package all it up, but the finding it out is the fun, right? I think so, anyway.
I've never heard of a virtual colonoscopy. I have to go look it up now.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to my
Please,
story.
please, everyone. So actually, when we were making Sciencing Out, it was about like all these women in history, and it was about elevating these women. And I don't know if you all do that or no, but like when I want to tell a story about someone, I also just like Google, I'm like, Florence Nightingale, and like racism, just to see like what comes up. And yes, like stories come up, and you're like, wow, she was racist. Or when we were talking about Lady Mary Montagu, who brought inoculation with herself, like from Turkey to England, there's like this fantastic story of like, and then England like got inoculation. And the story, when you look at it, like, they tested on inoculation, like people were not on board on it, and then they tested it, and like they're like, oh yeah, Princess Caroline at the time like tested it on her children so that everyone else can see it and do it. And you're like, whoa, before that they tested it on like prisoners and then orphan kids until like it got to, you know, Lady Mary Montagu, like, or she did it in Turkey, and like Princess Caroline. So there's like all these like horrible stories within a story that was supposed to be about like elevating these women. So as we were like filming and stuff, we had to like add like moments in the script, and we were like, pause, okay, like we need to talk about like how horrible this is. And like that's a part of like good science communication, where we want everyone to know that like science has a very complicated history. You have all these great things, and you had the Tuskegee experiment, and you had like this, you know, orphans being experimented on for this vaccination. So there was a moment we had to like tweak the stories for that.
Hi, I'm Shannon Shea. My question is, when there is so much going on in the world and you cover basic science that's not necessarily connected to public health or climate change or whatever, how do you make that matter? How do you make that relevant to people or engaged? And I know Ray has opinions on this because I did a panel with her on it, but I'd like to hear from everyone.
I think you were gonna say something.
Oh, I don't know. I don't worry about it too much, honestly. I mean, I feel like, you know, because the stories I'm telling are primarily, hopefully, human stories, people are always interested in human stories. And, like, I can tell you what I hate, when people try to, like, make it seem relevant by talking about, like, the practical applications it's going to have. It's like, no, put that in your grant proposal, but don't feed that to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, so... yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I think that I mostly struggle with it because I worry that I'm like complicit in the horrors of the world, you know? Like if I have a limited amount of time on this finite earth, and if I do a story on the pupfish, what does it mean that I'm not doing a story on some horrible thing that's existing and happening? So yeah, that is a struggle for me, and I don't have any easy answer to that. But I do think that, you know, news organizations are hungry for some variety, you know? We can't all just like dwell on the horror of everything. Like people need to be reminded that some people are still like trying to find out, like, you know, there is still a collaborative science process going on and people are contributing to it. And I think it's worth telling people. I don't know. I don't have a problem, honestly. Like, the stories I do, like I always think like, who's gonna like, you know, run this story about like science posters or whatever? Do you know what I mean? Like I think it's gonna be like a convincing thing, but no, people are always just like, oh yeah, you know. So I would just say like, let your freak flag fly. Do you know what I mean? Like your best bet is like standing out from the pack and doing something like so weird that like, you don't have to worry about getting scooped because like nobody else is doing that story. But like, I don't know. Like a story I read that I was completely fascinated by was a reporter, this is not a science story, but she somehow had found out that somebody had been posting pictures of her feet online. And so like she found out who it was and called him up and talked to him and wrote a story about it. And I'm just like, I read the whole thing. It was amazing. And like, I was just like, an editor's gonna want to run that story. Do you know what I mean? Like no matter what's happening, like anything could be happening in the world. And I think that story would get readers. So anyway.
I mean, I don't have a great answer to the question of, how to get people interested in like those things about basic science, other than to kind of circle back to that neurology story I did about the 85-year-old woman, is just like Nell said, always bring it back to people. I don't know that a general audience, would necessarily want to know about XYZ, protein in the brain that they found that is very specific to this one group of older people, but I tried to generalize it, and make them feel like they're reading about their grandmother.
Yeah. So something that comes to mind is like, and we saw that a lot in like the panel that was about like all the different kind of like videos. The short videos are really good at like eliciting curiosity, and if you look at some of like the curiosity literature, three of the things that really stand out is importance, which is usually like 10 things that is gonna like save your life if you know, like people wanna click on it. Surprise, which is like when you would like see something and you look at it and you're like, what is this thing? It looks weird, it looks kind of familiar, I'm not sure what it is, and you're surprised that it does do something, or like with the battery like burning the meat, you are surprised, right? So you want to know more what it is, and it might be relevant, it might not be relevant, and then primed, right? So if you see, like when Angelina Jolie and like Brad Pitt like broke up, like the news was everywhere. So like when you see about it, the more you see it, the more you want to know. Or a lot of people start talking more about like basic science when like Project Hail Mary came up, right? Or like when I was collecting my data at the planetarium, depending on like what was out in the movie, in the theater, like people would be asking those questions, right? Like, tell me about Interstellar or Martian, or how accurate was that? Because these are like primed and they're like hearing a lot about it. So I feel like just like focusing on some of those principles of curiosity would really help you like get that, interaction with even like basic science. And I think something that is also important is that entertainment, the joy, like sometimes we're like, oh, something has to be applicable to my life to be relevant to me. But joy and excitement and entertainment, these are all the things that are also like applicable to life. Like these are the things we're craving. So even like focusing on those things could be like super helpful.
Excellent. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay, so once again, this piggybacks quite nicely off of this question. So when it comes to sort of like instilling trust through narrative approaches, making a story relatable versus the sort of scientific integrity and scientific truth and being like as fully transparent as possible, even though that may be like put some audiences off, how do you kind of balance that dance between like having an attractive, trustworthy narrative and having like transparent science that gives like autonomy to the reader?
Maybe I don't understand the question. I guess I don't really see them in conflict.
Sorry, I didn't know if you were.
No, that's it.
Oh,
That's all
okay.
I got.
There was a study, it wasn't a study, I think it was an opinion piece that came out a few months ago, and I think the title was something like, Should Scientists Lie? And I think the conversation it was putting out is that with COVID and with a lot of things that are high in stakes, when scientists were very honest about like, we actually don't know what to do about this, people kind of like lost trust. I might be spreading misinformation. But I think some of it was that when you have these very transparent statements, people might be losing trust. So should we not be transparent and should we lie? But the problem with that is that the lie will come out. At some point, people would be like, oh, did you lie about this? Even when it's not intentional, right? So like, for example, with COVID, you had the masking dilemma, which it was like, oh, you don't really have to mask, which was more of a bad communication problem than like lying. Oh, you don't have to wear a mask yet because like the, hospital workers need the mask. And then later people were like, oh, it sounds like masking is super important. So were you lying to us? Were you not being fully transparent? And that completely destroyed a big part of that like trust spectrum, right? So I think it's a problematic thing. It is very complicated and I don't have an answer for it, but I understand this idea that like you can give a lot of information that would then cause this like distrust, but also sometimes you don't give that information and it comes to light and it ruins trust. So what do I do about it? I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have a great answer to that question either, but I guess I'll just close out with an example of sometimes I try to use this method of transparency, and it doesn't work for every outlet and every style of story, but trying to reveal some of my interview with the expert to try and build that trust with the reader of, and like Nell said, you don't need to like tell people, oh, because this expert says you need to do it, but just showing how I talk to them and how I'm sharing our conversation with you so everyone's open and honest with each other. So a couple years ago, ahead of the 2024 Paris Olympics, I had the opportunity to interview one of the Team USA psychologists. And it was fascinating talking about how the athletes who you think, all these gold medalists don't have any problems, but how they even have imposter syndrome. And it was really great like that. But our interview opened up with him asking me if I remembered my first time going to the dentist. So that was the opening of my story. It's like, okay, this Team USA psychologist asked me the first time I went to the dentist, and I could remember vividly. And he was like, yeah, so your parents probably brought you to the dentist so that, now as an adult, you're not afraid to go to the dentist because you've been 100 times in the last, 30 years. And he was saying that's what it's like with therapy. If people would just go when they're kids, then when they're adults, they're going to be like, oh, this is just like going to the dentist. I'm not scared of it. Anyway, so that was kind of going off on a tangent, but that was an example where I was able to kind of playfully share my interview and how the tables were turned. I kind of got asked the questions on that one and then sharing that with the reader.
Fantastic. Well, let's give the panel a big round of applause. Thank you so much.